Secret of the Mimic is finally on the horizon, and there's a lot to be excited for. Just about the entire community is waiting to see what's gonna happen, and whether or not Tales games will finally be either confirmed or debunked. Spoiler alert, don't expect either of those things to happen. However, on the other side of the same coin, there are a lot of questions that people have about the game, and what it's gonna do to the lore as a whole. Making prequels that were never originally intended is a dangerous game, and it could lead to things either feeling like retcons or just massive letdowns. But in rare cases, a prequel can avoid all of those pitfalls, and serve to elevate the story that comes after. And while I do hope that Secret of the Mimic is one of those rare cases, there's one thing in particular about it that worries me. And if that worry goes unchecked, it might spell trouble for the entire franchise as a whole. But first, I want to ask everyone a question. Who do you think William Afton's first murder victim was? And when do you think it happened? I promise you, this is relevant to the rest of the video. You'll see what I mean soon. So, think about it, leave your answer in the comments, make sure you like and subscribe while you're down there, and let me properly start things off with this particular image here. A human arm sticking out of an animatronic costume. Everyone in the community jumped on this image instantly, because if you know anything about the lore, you know that this has historically been William Afton's MO since the very start of the series. Thing is, this game is taking place in 1979. The earliest we've ever theorized for one of Afton's kills is 1983, the earliest possible timing for the death of Charlie before the MCI in 1985. On top of that, William's primary target for murder has always been children, but the human arm sticking out of this suit belongs to an adult, and they might even be wearing the same suit as us, which would make them a Fazbear employee. The chances that William killed this person are extremely unlikely, which just leaves one potential suspect, the Mimic. Considering this game takes place in Edwin's old workshop, and the Mimic has multiple confirmed kills in this very building as of its origin story, it's not exactly a stretch to believe that it's responsible for all of this. So then, why am I making this video? Seems like a pretty open and shut case, right? Well, not exactly. Let's talk about the methods that the Mimic is used for killing people. I know that not all of you have actually read the books, so I'll be showing you excerpts from the relevant story so that you know exactly where I'm getting this information from. We're gonna start off with Mimic's origin story, the Mimic, where we not only see Edwin build the thing, but also its first interaction with other people, namely David. From the very moment of its activation, Mimic starts doing exactly what it was intended to do, mimicking David's every move, even going so far as pretending to be holding objects that David is. Of all the things that David ends up doing though, there are two things in particular that the story makes note of Mimic watching. David putting things away in the fridge, and David hanging things up in the closet. Mimic and David are inseparable for basically the entirety of the story, all the way up until David's death. But even after David dies, Mimic continues to mimic all of the things that David used to do. This ultimately ends up enraging Edwin, and leads to him taking all of his pent-up frustrations out on the animatronic. To quote the story directly, he could almost feel his murderous thoughts pouring through his muscles, and transfusing through the metal into Mimic's systems. This ends the first half of the Mimic story. He learned several different actions from David, but also learned hatred and agony from Edwin. What this ultimately culminates into is a metallic monstrosity that bastardizes everything it used to do. The agony that he gained through Edwin turned him into a murder machine, and the innocent acts that David used to do have turned into ways for Mimic to discard bodies, crudely shoving them into refrigerators and hanging them up in closets. It's not just mimicking single actions, it's combining everything that it's seen throughout its life. Not only that, but it's also capable of actually learning. In the first epilogue from Tales, we see the Mimic get reactivated years later. When it does, he's given the task of disassembling endoskeletons, which he does effectively, due to being a giant animatronic, but then he ends up doing the exact same thing to actual humans. I don't think that this happened because the Mimic is just a murder machine though, because if it was, the Mimic would have just started killing people right away. It verbally asked for a task and then went on to complete it, only to misunderstand the task later on. Mimic has some level of intelligence, but that doesn't make it capable of cognitive thought like a regular person. Rather, it has a memory that it calls back to try and solve any task that it's given. I'm of the belief that throughout the epilogues, the Mimic can't really tell the difference between humans and endoskeletons, and that it's just trying to follow its task, popping off the arms and then the head. Putting together all of the information that the books give us about the Mimic gives us a pretty good understanding of how it operates. Its primary function is mimicry, but it's also capable of learning and understanding tasks, to some extent. However, it's not capable of actually thinking, it only really knows what it directly sees or is told. So then, that begs the question. Why is there a Fazbear Entertainment employee stuffed into an animatronic suit? the Mimic never saw anything get stuffed into a costume in his origin story, and chronologically, that's the only relevant form of media that takes place before the events of this game. The Mimic saw David himself crawl into costumes plenty of times, sure, but that's not the same as putting someone else into a costume. And when it comes to mimicking the act of getting into costume, well, we have plenty of examples of the Mimic doing exactly that. There are very few possibilities as to how the Mimic could have picked up on this habit of stuffing people into costumes. But there's one option in particular that stands out to me, and by this point, I'm sure all of you know who I'm about to bring up. William Afton. As I said earlier in this video, William Afton is known for doing this. It's his whole thing throughout the entire franchise. So the idea that the Mimic saw him doing it and then began to replicate it is pretty reasonable at first glance. That is, until you realize that, by all means, this shouldn't be possible. Like I said, the earliest possible kill for William Afton is in 1983, 4 years after this game takes place. Not only that, but that first potential kill didn't involve him shoving a kid into a suit. That didn't happen until 1985, another 2 years in the future. So the idea that the Mimic was able to witness the MCI take place and proceed to mimic it is fundamentally impossible. So we're left with a bit of a time paradox. The Mimic has to have seen someone get stuffed into a suit for it to be mimicking the action, and nobody was stuffed into a suit until multiple years after this game takes place. As it stands, this doesn't make any sense. Or does it? While it's true that the MCI doesn't happen for another 6 years, who's to say that this was the only time that William stuffed a child into a suit? Because if you're familiar with the books, you know of a certain other character associated with an animatronic costume. Andrew, from Fazbear Frights. For those who aren't caught up, allow me to bring you up to speed. Andrew was introduced to us as a child spirit keeping William Afton alive to prolong his suffering, and when we see him in The Man in Room 1280, he's specifically wearing the mask of a green alligator. Now, dead kids wearing masks that represent their associated animatronic is par for the course ever since FNAF 3's Happiest Day. So the fact that Andrew is wearing a green alligator mask means that he was most likely stuffed into an animatronic of the same design. However, the only animatronic alligator that we've ever had in this franchise has been Monty, whose earliest appearance was in Security Breach. That game takes place in the 2030s or something, way after William Afton's death. So Andrew being able to possess Monty seemed entirely impossible at first. That is, until now. Because in the newest Secret of the Mimic image teasers, we can see him. Monty in the 1970s playing alongside Mr. Hippo and what might possibly be Happy Frog. This actually isn't the first time that we learn of a green alligator costume in the history of this franchise. It actually gets brought up pretty early in the Mimic's origin story as well. I've never actually heard anyone bring that up before, which is kind of weird, honestly. But that's beside the point. The fact that we're seeing this in-game is still absolutely massive. Not only is this further proof of a green alligator character existing this early in the timeline, but he's even being associated with the mediocre melodies, the same characters that the Vengeful Spirit speaks through in Ultimate Custom Night. All of a sudden, the window for Andrew to be the Vengeful Spirit is wide open. And if he is, if Andrew is the Vengeful Spirit and he was stuffed into Monty, then all of a sudden, there's a real possibility that the Mimic would have witnessed William Afton stuffing someone into an animatronic costume, which would enable him to mimic the act and lead to the screenshot where we see a Fazbear employee stuffed into a suit. It actually all lines up kinda perfectly. Almost. It almost lines up perfectly. Unfortunately, there's one massive problem with the idea that Andrew died this early in the timeline. For the sake of argument, let's ignore the possibility of Andrew not being the Vengeful Spirit. I'm not interested in having that debate with anyone right now. Let's instead talk about what people have always believed about Andrew. Andrew is regularly referred to as the forgotten victim, the victim that went undocumented by anyone. Now, if he were killed this early in the timeline, that would make a lot of sense. This would be a one-off kill, and it would have taken place in an abandoned factory/workshop. It stands to reason that his death would be forgotten, considered nothing more than a missing persons case that went unsolved, unlike the MCI, which not only had media coverage, but an actual suspect. However, that would also go against everything that we've ever known about Andrew, because he's not just a forgotten victim of Afton. He's specifically a forgotten part of the MCI. In the very first story of Fazbear Frights, Into the Pit, we see a recreation of the MCI, except instead of there being 5 dead kids, there were 6 of them. This forgotten victim of Afton's was always associated with the rest of the MCI kids, but if Andrew dies this early in the timeline, then he wouldn't be associated with the rest of the MCI, so this doesn't actually work out. Either Into the Pit's 6-character MCI is a retcon, or Andrew didn't die at this point in the timeline. But if Andrew didn't die this early, then why is the Mimic stuffing someone into an animatronic costume? Realistically, there's no good answer for why the Mimic is doing this. All of Afton's other murders happened way after this game should be taking place, and he's the only character that the Mimic could have ever seen stuffing people into suits. Either Andrew died years before the MCI, which would retcon into the pit, or nobody died around this time, which would call into question why the Mimic decides to stuff dead bodies into animatronic costumes. Two horrible options that nobody wants. Listen, I want to have faith in this game. I want to have faith that the story is getting the care that it deserves. But considering the fact that the Mimic story makes special note of how the Mimic deals with dead bodies in the form of mimicking David's actions, it feels absurd to say that there's no significance to the Mimic stuffing a dead body into an animatronic costume. This is, by far, my biggest worry for this game, and it's something that I hope someone can come up with a reasonable explanation for. This isn't a simple timeline error that we can chalk up to multiple writers working on stories and not everyone being properly informed of everything. This is a potentially massive oversight on a massive project. I do want to bring up one potential answer that was brought up to me while I was still writing the script for this video. As I mentioned earlier, the Mimic struggles to tell the difference between humans and endoskeletons. That actually isn't a first for this series, though. Phone Guy warns us about this all the way back in FNAF 1. He warns us that if the animatronics think we're just a metal endoskeleton without a costume on, they'll try to force us into one, which is also what the Mimic is doing here. However, I don't actually think that's relevant. Everything that the Mimic does is a reflection of its past, and considering it's never even left Edwin's workshop at this point in the story, I'd be surprised if it knows to do that. Not to mention, Phone Guy specifically mentions that the endoskeleton's not in costume is against the rules at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, which hasn't even been founded yet by this point in the timeline. So, no, I don't think that has anything to do with this. Does that mean that this is a potentially lore-breaking oversight? God, I hope not. Seriously, I want to have faith in this game, and the franchise as a whole, but that's not always an easy task for me, especially with this newer era of FNAF media. On that note, I want to take a moment to talk about the Mimic as a whole before the end of the video. To be honest with you, I actually really liked the Mimic's origin story. I'm not usually a fan of the trope of Mimics in general, but I think that an animatronic without cognitive function replicating everything that's happened to it is actually a really cool concept. But to be entirely honest, my praise for the Mimic ends at the origin story. I honestly think that every other form of media that has the Mimic in it doesn't do it the justice that it deserves. The epilogues are repetitive and boring after a while, Ruin doesn't have the Mimic do much besides trick Cassie, and, well, that's about it. I mean, there's also Burn Trap and Glitch Trap, but the correlation that they may or may not have with the Mimic is a conversation for another day. I think that my biggest wish for Secret of the Mimic is that the Mimic actually gets the attention that it deserves. We still don't really know what the deal is with Jackie, but if she's not the Mimic, then I hope that she doesn't take up all of the screen time. And honestly, even if she is the Mimic, I don't want that to be all that the Mimic is in this game. I want to see the Mimic be what it was in its origin story, a dark reflection of the tragedy that it had to endure, lacking the cognitive ability to process it, only knowing how to replicate it. Because that's the best version of the Mimic. At least, I think so. But I'm gonna call things there. I could ramble on and on about what I want and don't want from this game for hours, but this isn't the time for that. Thanks for watching. I think that this is my first video that I legitimately want to age at least a little bit poorly. So if anyone watching this can come up with a reasonable explanation as for why the Mimic is doing things that it shouldn't know how to do, or can just tell me something that I missed, please let me know in the comments. Or make a video of your own, or hell, anything. I just want people to talk about things and try to come to conclusions together. I think this community is at its best when everyone is trying to consider all possibilities like the maniacs we all are. So until next time, take it easy.